Frank Doggett stood at the edge of the tarmac at Woomera, South Australia, on September 13, 1958, and watched a Bristol Bloodhound Mark I leave its launcher with what he later described to colleagues as an indecent acceleration. Doggett, a senior Bristol aircraft engineer seconded to the weapons research establishment, was accustomed to the missile's Thor ramjets by then. His American guests were not. 2 U.S. Air Force liaison officers invited under the 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement had flown in from Edwards to observe a proving round against a Jindivik target drone at 40,000 feet. The missile climbed, pitched over, and struck the drone within 11 seconds of launch. One of the Americans, according to a note filed later that week in the Ministry of Supply papers, now at Kew under AVIA 65, asked whether the telemetry had been faked. It had not. Bloodhound was a genuinely strange weapon by 1958 standards. It rode on 4 solid-fuel Gosling boosters bolted to its flanks, then sustained flight on 2 Bristol Thor ramjets running on kerosene at Mach 2.2. Its guidance came from a semi-active radar homing system slaved to a Type 83 Yellow River illuminator on the ground. Itself a compromised design the Air Ministry had inherited from a cancelled naval program. The Americans had nothing comparable in service. Their Bomarc, still in development at Boeing, was slower off the rail, heavier, and dependent on a nuclear warhead to guarantee a kill. Bloodhound killed with 90 kilograms of continuous rod high explosive and a proximity fuse designed at RRE Malvern. The Woomera trials of 1958 and 1959 were not, in themselves, secret. The fact that USAF technical intelligence officers were sitting in the blockhouse at Range E, taking notes on British ramjet performance figures they could not replicate, very much was. The arrangement had been negotiated quietly through the British Joint Services Mission in Washington earlier that year. Sir Stuart Mitchell, controller of guided weapons and electronics at the Ministry of Supply, had pushed for it against Treasury objections. He wanted the Americans to see what Bristol and Ferranti had built, because he wanted them to buy it. They very nearly did. A Bloodhound Mark II with improved Ferranti Type 86 illuminators and a longer-burning Thor variant achieved intercepts at ranges beyond 80 kilometers in trials conducted between 1961 and 1963. Sweden bought the system. Switzerland bought it. Australia bought it. The Americans studied it, wrote appreciative reports, and then declined, on grounds that had less to do with performance than with the industrial politics of the Pentagon. A cable from the British Embassy in Washington in March 1962, held in FO 371, records an unnamed USAF general remarking that the ramjet data was embarrassingly good, but that Congress would not fund a foreign air defense missile while Bomarc squadrons were still being stood up. The embarrassment was real, and it sat oddly against the wider story Britain was telling itself about decline. In 1958, the Sandys White Paper was barely a year old. Duncan Sandys had argued that manned aircraft were finished and that the future of air defense belonged to missiles. The RAF hated the paper. Bristol, Ferranti, and the boffins at RRE seized on it. Bloodhound was the vindication Sandys never got to enjoy in office. It was also briefly evidence that a country running down its empire could still build a weapon its principal ally could not match. At Woomera, the American liaison officer who had asked about the telemetry filed his report to Wright-Patterson on September 21, 1958. It ran to 14 pages. The first page began with a single underlined sentence. The British claims had been verified. The Thor ramjet was the thing that unsettled the Americans, and it had been designed by a team at Bristol Engine Company under Dr. William Hawthorne between 1949 and 1954. Hawthorne had spent the war on jet propulsion at power jets under Frank Whittle. Ramjets were, in principle, simple. No moving parts, no turbine, just a shaped duct in which incoming air was compressed by forward motion, mixed with fuel, ignited and expelled. In practice, they were vicious. Combustion was unstable, ignition at altitude was unreliable, and the entire device only worked once the missile was already travelling above Mach 1.4. Bristol's engineers solved these problems empirically, running hundreds of static tests at Patchway near Filton, and by 1956 the Thor was producing a specific impulse figure that Rolls-Royce's own liquid fuel program could not approach. The Americans knew ramjets. Marquardt had built them for the Bomarc and for the abandoned Navajo cruise missile. What they had not managed was the sustained, throttleable, boost to Mach 2, 0.5 performance the Thor delivered in a package small enough to bolt to a tactical air defense missile. The internal Bristol reports, several of which were later declassified into the DEF-E15 series at Kew, show that Thor produced roughly 3,000 pounds of thrust at Mach 2 at 40,000 feet, on kerosene, indefinitely. Marquardt's equivalent burned faster, ran hotter, and needed more careful fuel management. The gap was not huge in absolute terms, it was large enough to matter operationally. At RAE Farnborough, the aerodynamicists working on Bloodhound's control system had made a second bet that paid off. Rather than steer the missile by moving control surfaces at the tail, they had swiveled the entire wing, a configuration known as twist and steer. This gave the missile ferocious agility at high altitude, where conventional tail-controlled weapons became sluggish. American observers at Woomera watched Bloodhound perform 20 G-turns at 50,000 feet against maneuvering targets. In a note dated November 4, 1958, and now filed in AIR 20, Air Vice Marshal Kenneth Cross, then Air Officer commanding Bomber Command, recorded that a visiting SAC officer had told him the performance was, candidly, better than we thought possible from a British firm. Cross found the remark irritating. He also filed it. The RAF Fighter Command Staff at Bentley Priory had been briefed on Bloodhound since 1956, and the 1st Operational Squadron, number 264 at RAF North Coats in Lincolnshire, had stood up in December 1958. By the end of 1959, 11 Bloodhound sites were operational or building, arranged in a belt across East Anglia, to defend the V-bomber bases at Marham, Honington, Coningsby, Waddington and Scampton. The doctrine was blunt. Bloodhound existed to buy Bomber Command enough time to get the Valiants, Victors and Vulcans airborne with their Blue Danube and later Yellow Sun freefall nuclear weapons before Soviet Badgers and Bisons could crater the runways. Whether it would have worked in 1959 is a question historians still argue. Sir Michael Quinlan in later writings thought the belt would have degraded rather than defeated a determined Soviet raid. Peter Hennessy has been more generous, noting that even a partial Bloodhound screen shifted Soviet planning assumptions in a way GCHQ intercepts later confirmed. What is clear is that by 1960, the British government had a working, deployed high-altitude area defense missile of a kind the United States, France and the Soviet Union were still trying to match. Whitehall knew it. So did the Americans who had signed the non-disclosure paperwork at Woomera. The question the Ministry of Supply now faced was what to do with the advantage. Selling weapons abroad had in 1959 become a matter of cabinet-level attention. Harold Macmillan's government was under Treasury pressure to reduce the balance of payments deficit that had opened up during the 1956 Suez Adjustment. Duncan Sandys, moved from defence to aviation in October 1959, brought Bloodhound with him as a portfolio item. The Board of Trade and the Foreign Office produced a joint memorandum, now in CAB 130, arguing that British high-technology exports could earn hard currency at rates the traditional industries could not match. Bloodhound was named in the memorandum as an exemplar. The first foreign customer was Sweden. The Swedish Air Force had been evaluating air defense missiles since 1956, comparing Bloodhound against the American Nike Hercules and the French PARCA. A Swedish technical mission visited Woomera in March 1959, and a second larger delegation went to Bristol's Filton Works in July. The Swedes wanted a non-nuclear system which ruled out Nike Hercules in its intended configuration. They wanted range and altitude which ruled out PARCA. They ordered Bloodhound Mark I in 1960 under the designation Robot System 65. The contract, worth roughly £14 million at the time, was announced in the Commons by Peter Thornycroft on December 15, 1960. Australia followed. The Royal Australian Air Force ordered Bloodhound Mark I for the defence of Darwin and Williamtown, taking delivery from 1961. Switzerland ordered Bloodhound Mark II in 1962 for the defence of the Alpine passes and the industrial centres of the Mittelland. The Swiss deal was politically significant because Switzerland was neutral and had spent the previous decade playing American and European suppliers off against each other. The Swiss chose Bloodhound after a comparative trial at Emmen, at which the missile achieved 8 intercepts from 10 attempts against high-altitude targets. The 2 failures were traced to a batch fault in the illuminator klystrons and corrected within weeks. The Americans watched all of this with polite frustration. A report by the USAF Foreign Technology Division, dated April 1962, and referenced in later declassified NSA histories, concluded that Bloodhound Mark II was the most capable non-nuclear high-altitude surface-to-air missile currently in service anywhere. That verdict did not translate into a purchase. The Kennedy administration, briefed by Robert McNamara's WizKids at the Pentagon, preferred to invest in the extended-range Hawk and in the Nike family upgrades already funded through the FY 1962 defense budget. Congress, as the British Embassy cable of March 1962 had accurately predicted, would not authorize a foreign air defense purchase while domestic programs were still spending down. The one door that remained ajar was Canada. The Royal Canadian Air Force had operated Bomarc from 1961 at North Bay and La Macaza, but found the missile's dependence on a nuclear warhead politically toxic under John Diefenbaker's Conservative government. British diplomats at the High Commission in Ottawa, working with the Ministry of Aviation, proposed Bloodhound Mark II as a conventional alternative. A technical brief was prepared in the summer of 1962 by the JIC's Scientific Subcommittee, arguing that Bloodhound could be integrated with the existing SAGE air defense network, with modest modifications. The proposal reached the desk of Douglas Harkness, the Canadian Defence Minister, in September 1962. Then, in the last week of October 1962, everything about air defence in North America changed. A U-2 photographed medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction in western Cuba. Overnight, the argument in Ottawa about high-altitude aircraft interception became a footnote. Bloodhound in Whitehall suddenly looked less like an export triumph and more like a weapon that might have to fire in earnest. The cabinet met at Downing Street on the morning of October 23, 1962. Macmillan had been briefed the previous evening by David Ormsby Gore, the British ambassador in Washington, who had received the Kennedy administration's evidence over dinner at the White House on the 21st. Ormsby Gore had been shown the U-2 photographs by the president himself. He had, according to his own later account and to the record in PREM 11, accepted their authenticity within minutes. Macmillan accepted his ambassador's judgment without independent verification. The JIC's scientific and technical intelligence staff, working from Storey's Gate, would not receive their own copies of the imagery until October 24th. Bloodhound that week was in an odd position. The RAF's operational squadrons in Lincolnshire and East Anglia were on the same alert state system as the V-bombers they protected. When Bomber Command went to Alert Condition 3 on October 27th, the Bloodhound sites went with them. Warheads were mated to missiles, illuminators were run up and calibrated. Crews slept in their vehicles. At RAF Woodhall Spa, at RAF Marham, at RAF Rattlesden, the men of numbers 62, 242, 257 and 266 squadrons stood ready to engage Soviet aircraft that were not, in the event, coming. What Bloodhound could not do was intercept a ballistic missile. The system had never been designed for that role. Bristol had studied the possibility briefly in 1959 under the codename Blue Envoy, but the program had been cancelled in favour of a straight extension of the existing Mark I airframe into the Mark II. If Soviet R-12 missiles from Cuba or R-14S from the western military districts of the Soviet Union had been launched against British fire bomber bases, Bloodhound would have watched them fly past. This was understood at the highest levels of Whitehall. It was also, during the last week of October 1962, not spoken about outside the JIC and the small circle within the MOD that Peter Thornycroft, now Defence Minister, chaired daily. The Bloodhound crews were told what they needed to know. The rest they inferred. Douglas Cochrane, later a group captain, was a young flight lieutenant at RAF Marham on October 27th, and recalled in an oral history recorded for the IWM Sound Archive in 1998 that we knew we were the shield for the sword. What we did not know and did not ask was whether the shield covered the whole of the sky or only part of it. The answer, he said, we could work out for ourselves if we thought about it, which we mostly did not. Meanwhile, at Cheltenham, GCHQ was reading the traffic. British Y service stations at Scarborough and Cheadle, feeding into the Cheltenham processing centres, picked up increased Soviet long-range aviation activity from bases at Engels and Ukrainka. The intelligence shared with NSA at Fort Meade under the 1946 UK-USA agreement contributed to the American assessment that Soviet strategic forces were being brought to a higher state of readiness. What GCHQ also detected, and what mattered more to Bloodhound crews, was the absence of Soviet fighter escorts of the kind that would have accompanied a serious bomber raid on Western Europe. The crisis ended on October 28th with Khrushchev's broadcast agreeing to withdraw the missiles from Cuba. The Bloodhound sites stood down from their highest alert state over the following week. In Ottawa, meanwhile, the Canadian purchase discussion had been overtaken. Diefenbaker's government fell in April 1963, and the incoming Pearson administration accepted nuclear warheads for Bomarc. Bloodhound had lost its North American opening. What it had gained unexpectedly was operational credibility no export brochure could match. The Mark II was a different weapon. Bristol had begun design studies in 1958, and the first operational rounds were delivered to the RAF in 1964. The improvements were incremental in description, but transformational in effect. The Thor ramjets were rebuilt for longer sustained burn, extending the missile's engagement envelope from roughly 60 kilometers to more than 130. The Ferranti Type 86 continuous wave illuminator replaced the Type 83, giving better performance against low-flying targets and much improved resistance to jamming. Solid-state electronics replaced valves in the guidance computer. The missile could now engage targets down to 500 feet and up to 65,000, a spread no comparable system in NATO service could match in 1964. Deployment was reorganized. The old East Anglian belt, oriented for the defense of Bomber Command's bases, was replaced by a more dispersed pattern. The RAF Germany contribution, No. 25 Squadron at RAF Larbruck, and later at Bruggen and Wildenrath, took Bloodhound Mark II forward to the Rhine as part of NATO's 2nd Allied Tactical Air Force. This was the deployment that mattered strategically. British Bloodhound sites in Germany protected NATO airfields, headquarters and communications nodes against Soviet frontal aviation. The doctrine, worked out at HQRAF Germany at Rheindahlen, integrated Bloodhound firing engagements with USAF, Hawk batteries and Belgian Nike sites in a layered scheme. The Americans by 1965 had come to a settled view. They would not buy Bloodhound. They would, however, cooperate on data. A Memorandum of Understanding signed at the Pentagon in June 1965, referenced in DEFE 24 files, established that British and American air defense missile programs would share test data, target drone results, and jamming trial outcomes. The clause that mattered was reciprocity. British engineers gained access to Nike Hercules and Hawk performance data. American engineers gained access to Bloodhound Mark II trial results. For Bristol and Ferranti, this was a subsidy in kind. For the US Army Missile Command at Redstone Arsenal, it was validation of design choices they were still making for the next generation. The Cabinet Office archives from this period show a striking absence of triumphalism. Dennis Healey, who became Defense Secretary in October 1964 and remained until 1970, took a strictly comptroller's view. In a minute to the Chief of the Air Staff dated February 12, 1965, held in DEFE 25, Healey wrote that Bloodhound Mark II is a good weapon and a good export. Neither justifies further investment beyond what is programmed. He was resistant to the follow-on studies that Bristol and later, after the 1959 merger, the Bristol Aerojet Consortium were pushing. He was equally resistant to the Air Staff's periodic requests for a Mark III with anti-ballistic capability. British defence policy under Healey ran on the principle that Bloodhound was to be used, not extended. Deployment abroad continued. Singapore took delivery of Bloodhound Mark II in 1970 for the defence of Tengah and Seletar, part of the residual British commitment east of Suez that Healey had already committed to run down. Saudi Arabia took Bloodhound in 1965 under an agreement negotiated by BAC and the Ministry of Aviation, part of a wider Saudi order that also included Lightning fighters and Strike Master trainers. The Swiss upgraded their existing Mark I's to Mark II standard through the 1970s. The Swedish robot system 65 served until 1978. In each case, the pattern was the same. The customer wanted a non-nuclear high-altitude defence, considered the alternatives and chose British. By the end of the decade, Bloodhound had become something Whitehall no longer needed to advertise. Its reputation carried it. What Whitehall did need and did not yet have was a coherent story about what would replace it. The replacement question mattered because Bloodhound was, by 1975, beginning to look old. The Soviet Air Force had introduced backfire, the Tu-22M, capable of low-level supersonic penetration profiles that stressed even Mark II's improved envelope. Soviet air-launched cruise missiles were entering service. The threat picture, briefed to the Defense and Overseas Policy Committee by the JIC in successive assessments, was moving away from the high-altitude bomber Bloodhound had been designed to kill. The RAF wanted a successor. The Air Staff produced a series of operational requirements, most substantially OR.3197, calling for a system that could engage low-level cruise missiles as well as manned aircraft. The candidates were the American Patriot, still in development, and a European consortium proposal that eventually became the Franco-Italian SAMP/T. Neither was ready. The Ministry of Defence under Roy Mason and then Fred Mulley in the Callaghan government extended Bloodhound Mark II's service life through a series of mid-life updates. The Ferranti illuminators were modernised again. The guidance computers were replaced with digital units built by Marconi. The missiles themselves, held in bunkers at RAF West Raynham, RAF Bawdsey, and RAF North Coats, were refurbished and recertified. The updates worked technically. What they could not disguise was that Bloodhound Mark II, however capable at altitude, could not deal reliably with the low-level penetrating threat that dominated the 1980s threat assessments. GCHQ intelligence, shared with the JIC's current intelligence groups, showed Soviet training exercises emphasizing terrain-following flight profiles at 200 feet and below. Bloodhound's minimum engagement altitude of 500 feet, adequate in 1964, was no longer sufficient. The Thatcher government from May 1979 inherited the problem. Francis Pym at Defence and then John Nott from January 1981 faced budget pressure that made a like-for-like Bloodhound successor politically impossible. Nott's 1981 Defence Review, published as Command 8288, cut heavily into the surface fleet and rationalised air defence. Bloodhound was retained but not replaced. The air staff were told to plan for a Rapier and fighter combination, using the Panavia Tornado F.3 in the air defense variant and Rapier for point defense, with Bloodhound bridging the gap until a new area defense system could be procured. The Tornado F3 was late. Rapier, in its FSA and FSB variants, was excellent against tactical aircraft but had limited engagement range. The gap Bloodhound was bridging kept widening. Air Chief Marshal Sir Peter Harding, later CAS from 1988, wrote in his post-retirement memoir that the mid-1980s were the period in which we relied longest on the missile we had built, the least recently. Bloodhound was, by 1985, older than most of the aircrew guarding it. Deployment continued to shrink. The RAF Germany squadrons were withdrawn as the German air defence was rationalised. The remaining UK sites concentrated in Lincolnshire and East Anglia, defending the Tornado bases at Coningsby and Leuchars, and by inference the American bases at Lakenheath, Mildenhall and Upper Hayford. Crews trained on annual firing camps at Aberporth and less frequently at the Hebrides Range. The record was impressive. Between 1965 and 1985, RAF Bloodhound crews fired more than 300 practice rounds. The hit rate, according to declassified summaries in AIR-8 files, exceeded 85% throughout the period. By the late 1980s, Whitehall was making the quiet calculations that precede any weapons withdrawal from service. The Ministry of Defence's long-term costings, prepared under Michael Heseltine and then George Younger, projected Bloodhound out to 1991 or 1992 with no successor decision made. The Cold War, however, was moving faster than the procurement cycle. What ended Bloodhound was not a replacement contract. It was the collapse of the threat that had justified it. Mikhail Gorbachev's arrival at the Kremlin in March 1985 was, in the Bloodhound story, the beginning of the end. The threat assessments that had sustained the missile through 3 midlife updates began slowly to shift. The JIC's assessments of Soviet strategic aviation capability, prepared quarterly for the cabinet, moved from steady concern in 1985 to guarded reassessment by 1987. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of December 1987 removed a whole category of Soviet missile threats to Western Europe. The RAF air defense problem simplified. Bloodhound's continued existence became a matter of accounting rather than doctrine. The final firings at Aberporth in Cardigan Bay were, according to the recollections of RAF regiment officers who attended them, unsentimental. The last operational Bloodhound Mark II Squadron, No. 85 Squadron at RAF West Raynham, disbanded on July 10, 1991. The missiles were withdrawn to storage at Kinnerton, the warheads separated and returned to the Atomic Weapons Establishment at Aldermaston for accounting, and the launchers cut up for scrap or preserved at museums. A single complete Bloodhound Mark II site, with launchers, illuminators and control cabins, was preserved at the RAF Air Defence Radar Museum at Neatishead in Norfolk. The weapon had served for 33 years in one form or another. In that time it had never been fired in anger. The RAF's institutional view, expressed in the internal history commissioned by the Air Historical Branch, was that this was Bloodhound's greatest achievement. Air Vice Marshal Ron Dick, writing in Air Clues in 1989, argued that Bloodhound had done exactly what a strategic air defense weapon was supposed to do. It had made the calculation of a Soviet raid harder. It had complicated the arithmetic of deterrence. It had contributed, in a small but measurable way, to the outcome that the Cold War had ended without a general war in Europe. The export dimension had a similar quiet conclusion. The Swedish, Swiss, Singaporean, Saudi, and Australian systems were withdrawn in various stages between 1978 and the mid-1990s. Ferranti and BAC, the successor companies to the original Bristol and RRE contractors, absorbed the Bloodhound engineering into later programs. Some of the ramjet expertise fed into the Sea Dart naval missile, which had used Thor-derived propulsion. Some of the illuminator technology fed into the Type 909 radar of the Sea Dart system, and, more distantly, into the later Seawolf and Sea Scepter programs. The genealogical line from Filton in 1954 to modern Royal Navy air defence in the 21st century runs in one important sense through Bloodhound. The American assessment by 1991 had shifted with the times. A US Army Air Defense Artillery School study of the period, later cited in Norman Friedman's writings on Cold War air defense, acknowledged that Bloodhound had been a technically superior system whose principal weakness was that it was not American. The judgment was fair. Bristol, Ferranti, and RRE had built a weapon that outperformed its intended competitors on almost every technical measure, and lost the largest market for reasons that had nothing to do with the missile itself. What Bloodhound demonstrated, and what the papers at Kew now make clear, was that Britain in the 1950s and 1960s could still design and produce weapons at the technological frontier. The country that lost Suez, gave up its empire, and worried publicly about its decline was, quietly building a missile the Americans could not match and selling it to the neutrals of Europe. The gap between the public story of decline and the private reality of continuing technical capacity was, in Bloodhound's case, very wide indeed. The papers that document all of this have accumulated at Kew over the decades since the 30-year rule released the first tranche of Bloodhound files in the late 1980s. The AVIA 65 series, covering the Ministry of Supply and later Ministry of Aviation, is the fullest record of the design and export story. The DEFE 15 and DEFE 24 series from the Ministry of Defence and its predecessors cover the operational and doctrinal side. The AIR 20 and AIR 8 series contain the RAF zone records, including squadron histories, firing camp results, and the internal debates about replacement. PREM 11 and PREM 13, covering the Macmillan, Home and Wilson premierships, contain the cabinet-level correspondence about export sales. What these papers show, read together, is a weapon that punched above its country's weight. Britain in 1958 was not the industrial power it had been in 1945. Its aircraft industry, in the aftermath of the Sandys White Paper, was contracting. Its atomic weapons program was being folded into an increasingly dependent relationship with the Americans through the 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement. Its economy was struggling with the balance of payments consequences of a currency it could not devalue without political cost. Against that background, Bloodhound was an anomaly. It was designed and built by British firms with British capital, using British scientific talent. And it worked. It was sold to sophisticated foreign customers who had every option open to them and who chose it on merit. It served for a third of a century in RAF hands without being fired in anger, and left service having contributed to a Cold War outcome that its designers in 1954 could not have predicted. The Americans who had watched Doggett's Woomera launch in September 1958 and asked whether the telemetry was fake had understood something the British political class of the period did not always grasp. British engineering at its best was still capable of surprising the world. The failure was not technical, it was institutional. Britain in the 1950s and 1960s did not have and could not build the industrial political apparatus that turned American weapons programs into global standards. Bloodhound was the missile the Pentagon would not buy for reasons that had nothing to do with the missile. Sir Peter Hennessy, in his writings on the post-war British state, has argued that the period from 1945 to about 1975 was one in which Britain punched above its weight in ways that were then systematically forgotten. Bloodhound is a case in point. The weapon disappeared quickly from public memory after its 1991 retirement. Its designers, most of them retired by the late 1980s, wrote no memoirs and gave few interviews. Bristol Aerojet, the successor company, was absorbed into successive defense industrial consolidations. By the time of the 1998 Strategic Defense Review, Bloodhound was already an item of institutional folklore rather than operational memory. The lessons, such as they are hedged. Bloodhound did what British air defence needed for a generation. It did not save the aircraft industry that produced it. It did not persuade the Americans to buy British in bulk. It did not, on its own, reverse the pattern of decline in British defence exports that set in during the 1970s and continues to be debated by historians. What it did was work. On September 13th, 1958 at Woomera, and for 33 years afterwards, it worked. That, for the men who built it and for the crews who stood watch with it through the coldest years of the Cold War, was enough.